granary of India was just 200 years ago, was a desert, fit only for nomadic tribes. But it was irrigation that made Punjab so green and productive. So these are the two regions which are the hotspots of irrigation. And this is where canal irrigation was a big contributor to agriculture and was the mainstay of agriculture. But in the past 50 years, this scenario has changed. India is irrigating, or our farmers are using even more water in agriculture than they used to do at the time of independence. But the way in which our farmers irrigate use water in agriculture has changed in a fundamental way. Today, India has become the groundwater champion of the world. There is no other country that uses more groundwater from wells and tube wells as much as India does. This map shows the spread of wells, irrigation wells in India. Each of these dots on the map, it shows 5,000 irrigation wells. So you can imagine that we have millions of wells which are used for irrigation in our country. The same is the case with Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Tarai areas of Nepal. So this has become the key agrarian characteristic of our country. So each of these dots represents 5,000 irrigation wells. India has today 15 million, 1.5 crore electric pumps, which are used mostly in northwest, west, and southern India, and about 11 million diesel pumps, which are placed into service for irrigating crops. Every year, we use 12,000 to 15,000 crore units of electricity and 30 to 50 crore liters of diesel to pump water from wells to irrigate crops. And this irrigates about 6 to 7 crore hectares, which feed India. This chart shows that around 1960 or 70, United States, Western Europe were very big users of groundwater in agriculture. But today, India is the largest user of groundwater in agriculture in the whole world. Every fourth farmer in India has an irrigation well. So the main water crisis in our country, or the water challenge in our country, is to govern the groundwater irrigation by wells. This map shows that whereas this boom in groundwater irrigation started way back in 1960s, much of the activity has occurred after 1990s. So we are in the midst of a major increase in groundwater use in agriculture that is taking place in India. And this map, 4 maps, they show the number of irrigation wells in different periods of India's recent history. And it shows that most of the well development or groundwater development has occurred during the past 20 years. Why has India become the groundwater champion of the world? And many theories have been expounded. During the 1950s and 60s, state governments as well as government of India tried very hard to get farmers to use wells for irrigation. Farmers were reluctant to use wells and tube wells for irrigating their fields. And the government started giving farmers subsidies on power, on electricity connections to start using groundwater. And when this policy began to succeed, it succeeded so much that it became a cause for concern because we had a huge expansion in groundwater. So there are very close linkages between the development of groundwater irrigation in our country and the energy policies that the state electricity boards throughout the country have followed. But another major driver of well irrigation in India has been the growing population pressure on agriculture. There are many other countries, especially in Europe and the New World, that is the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, where as industrial growth took place, they were able to make an orderly transfer of people from agriculture to the non-agricultural economy. But in India and China, in South Asia and China, this orderly transfer of people has become very, very difficult. So, for example, over the past 50 years, the average land holding that a farmer family has to make a livelihood has now shrunk so much that a farmer has to make very intensive use of his land. Unless he takes 3 crops a year, he's just not able to produce enough to survive and to make his family's needs. So this decline in the size of the farm holding is an important driver of well irrigation growth in India. Also, groundwater aquifers have traditionally been the most reliable buffer storages during droughts and famines. We know that in our history, whenever there was a drought, the king used to build ponds and tanks and step wells, but the farmer always used to dig wells. And that is the situation even today. While our number of wells increases dramatically during periods of drought and famines, because farmer finds that the aquifer is the best resort during a drought year. So both in India as well as in China, well digging activity tends to pick up during droughts, and they do even now. So over the past 50 years, we have found that many sources of irrigation that we and our elders had seen, like bullock balers, or public tube wells, or irrigation tanks, and even large canal irrigation systems, they are gradually on the way out. And power subsidies and new electricity connections are actually driving farmers away from these traditional sources of irrigation and getting them to latch on to tube well irrigation. So groundwater levels throughout in many parts of India are falling, and all these traditional modes of irrigation are also dropping, and electric tube wells are becoming the mainstay of irrigation. With the reason that in western and southern India, right from Punjab down to Tamil Nadu, we find that power subsidies have driven out all these traditional modes of irrigation, and we have a huge crisis both in the energy sector as well as in the groundwater sector. The left side of this map shows the energy divide in Indian irrigation. All the red areas or red districts, they show districts where electric tube wells, they dominate irrigation. And the yellow area shows the diesel tube well. Now the electric tube wells have been overpumped because of subsidy on power. And the results are clear in the map on the right hand side, which shows the areas where groundwater levels have been dropping. So the entire Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, this entire western corridor of India is facing for the past 20 years this secular decline in groundwater table, which is associated with poor quality of groundwater. As you pump groundwater from greater and greater depths, you also pump groundwater with very high concentrations of fluoride. So North Gujarat, for example, many parts of Saurashtra, the water that our people drink has such high concentration of fluoride that young children have problems of dental fluorosis and skeletal fluorosis. You just have to walk into a village in Sabarkantha to see what the consequences of this crisis are like. So basically, if we were managing our groundwater right, then even if we expanded the use of groundwater, during every monsoon, every good monsoon, water table would bounce back, and therefore we would have an equilibrium over time with larger and larger fluctuations around a mean. But what is happening in most of India is this, that the water table is not bouncing back to the pre-development level at the end of every monsoon. So there is a secular decline in the mean groundwater level, with the result that even during monsoon or after monsoon, we are pumping water from greater and greater depth. Now, Gujarat has, I think, recognized this problem over the past 20 years, and some remarkable work has taken place in Saurashtra and some parts, Saurashtra, Kutch, and some parts of North Gujarat. We have witnessed a massive popular movement in water harvesting and groundwater recharge, and that is yielding very good results. And it's kind of a showcase for many other parts of India and many other countries of the world. These remote sensing maps show that between 1989 and 1999, there was a clear increase, there was a significant increase in the moisture availability in soils in Saurashtra as well as North Gujarat, which shows the impact that water harvesting has had. And in the subsequent 8 years, this is the data provided by the Central Groundwater Board, which monitors water level changes in the entire state. And in 2000, there were still large number of red spots in Saurashtra and North Gujarat. And we can see that 10 years later, there has been a significant decline in the number of red. So Gujarat is the only state where agriculture growth is actually speeding up, and yet the groundwater situation is generally improving, although there are still hot spots. Another major innovation in Gujarat has been on the energy field. In most Western states, free power or highly subsidized power is provided without any quantity restrictions. But Gujarat has implemented this scheme called Jyotigram, under which it has separated agricultural tube well feeders from the rural feeders, which has produced major advantages in the sense that it has enabled Gujarat to provide 24/7 power to households in the villages, and at the same time it has enabled Gujarat distribution companies to ration power supply to farmers. So you're providing farmers subsidized power, but farmer cannot use more than 6 or 7 or 8 hours of power every day. And that power supplied is good quality power. So this has not only reduced the subsidies that Gujarat electricity boards are providing to farmers, but it's also put a cap on the overall groundwater withdrawal. So I think that the groundwater challenge or the water challenge in Indian agriculture are extremely complex. And I and some colleagues have been doing research on these issues from Anand. We have done several interesting studies in collaboration with economics teachers from Gujarat. We, for example, did a study of the impact of Jyotigram scheme 4 or 5 years ago, in which 16, 17 college teachers from different districts collaborated with us. We also last year completed a study of Krishi Mahotsav. You know, Gujarat government is the first government which has been kind of doing agricultural extension in a campaign mode. And we had 18, 19 college teachers collaborating with us in doing an assessment of the impact of Krishi Mahotsav. So before closing my address, I want to invite those of you who are interested in such research in water, agriculture, and livelihood issues to be in touch with us and to collaborate with us. And I welcome you to join with us in understanding the issues better. I once again would like to thank the Gujarat Economic Association for giving me this priceless opportunity. I want to thank Mohanbhai Patel also for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
सर, आपका बहुत बहुत आभार। आज के इस उद्घाटन सत्र के अंतिम चरण में अंतःकरण से स्फुरित आभार के भाव को व्यक्त करने के लिए मैं अर्थशास्त्र विभाग के प्राध्यापक दीपक भाई परमार को आमंत्रित करती हूँ।
गुजरात राज्य अर्थशास्त्र मंडळनी आ 43મી કોન્ફરન્સના ઉદ્ઘાટન પ્રસંગના અંતિમ ચરણમાં આભાર વ્યક્ત કરતા હું આનંદ અને ગૌરવની લાગણી અનુભવું છું. આજના આ પ્રસંગે સૌ પ્રથમ આભાર માનવા માટે હું શ્રી ભીખુભાઈ પટેલ સાહેબને વિનંતી કરું કે એમના થકી આજની કોન્ફરન્સ શક્ય બની છે. જીએના ઉદ્ઘાટન પ્રસંગમાં શ્રી ભીખુભાઈ સાહેબે કહ્યું તેમ કે 50મી કોન્ફરન્સ પણ અહીંયા જ ઉજવાય એનું આમંત્રણ આપીને આ કોન્ફરન્સને વધુ ઉત્સાહી બનાવે છે એવા શ્રી ભીખુભાઈ પટેલ સરનો આ પ્રસંગે ખૂબ આભાર માનું છું. ગુજરાત અર્થશાસ્ત્ર પરિષદના કાયમી પ્રમુખ ડૉક્ટર રોહિતભાઈ શુક્લા સાહેબ કે જેમણે અમારી આ સંસ્થાને આ 43મી પરિષદ યોજવા માટે પસંદ કરી અને સતત જીએનો વિકાસ કઈ રીતે કરવો, વિદ્યાર્થીઓ અને શિક્ષકોને કઈ રીતે તૈયાર કરવા એની ચિંતા કરતા શ્રી રોહિતભાઈ શુક્લા સાહેબનો આ પ્રસંગે આભાર માનું છું. આઈએના સેક્રેટરી શ્રી ડૉક્ટર અનિલ ઠાકુર સાહેબ કે જેઓ પટનાથી આ પ્રસંગે ખાસ ઉપસ્થિત રહ્યા છે એમનો પણ આભાર માનું છું. શ્રી હિંમતભાઈ પટેલ સાહેબ કે જેઓ સતત અમારી કોલેજમાં વિદ્યાર્થીઓ અને અધ્યાપકો સાથે રહીને સંસ્થાના વિકાસમાં અને જીએના છેલ્લા 10 દિવસથી સતત દરેક કાર્યક્રમમાં ભાગ લઈને મદદ કરનારા શ્રી હિંમતભાઈ પટેલ સાહેબનો પણ આ પ્રસંગે આભાર માનું છું. શ્રી એ શેખ સાહેબ એમનો પણ આ પ્રસંગે આભાર માનું છું. ડૉક્ટર અલકનંદાબેન પટેલ કે જેઓ હમણાં જ અમેરિકાથી આવીને અમારી સાથે હાજર છે અને એમને પ્રોત્સાહિત કરે છે એમનો પણ આભાર માનું છું. જે લાલીવાલા સાહેબ કે જેઓ લગભગ 85 વર્ષની ઉંમરે પણ હાલમાં સતત લખાણ લખીને આગળ વધતા રહ્યા છે અને જીએમાં એમનું સારું એવું યોગદાન છે એમનો પણ આભાર માનું છું. સંસ્થાના ઉત્સાહી આચાર્ય ડૉક્ટર મોહનભાઈ પટેલનો આભાર આ પ્રસંગે ભૂલી શકાય તેમ નથી, કારણ કે એમના થકી જ આ 43મી કોન્ફરન્સનું આયોજન થઈ શક્યું છે. સાથે સાથે સરદાર પટેલ એજ્યુકેશન ટ્રસ્ટના અન્ય સભ્યશ્રીઓ, ભગીની સંસ્થાના આચાર્યો, અધ્યાપકો, ડાયરેક્ટરશ્રીઓ તથા સ્ટેજની સામેની સાઈડ બેઠા ડૉક્ટર સુનિલ પારેખ સાહેબ, ઇલાબેન ભટ્ટ, વીડી શાહ, મહેશ પાઠક અને જો કદાચ નામ બોલવા જાઉં તો ઘણો સમય લાગે એટલે નામી અનામી સર્વ તજજ્ઞ વિદ્યાર્થીઓ, અધ્યાપકો સર્વનો આભાર માનું છું. અસ્તુ.
Thank you, sir. Here we end the first session of the inaugural function and move towards the second one. That is Dr. I.G. Patel Memorial Lecture.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Professor Alaknandaben Patel is the wife of Dr. I.G. Patel. She is a visiting professor at Center for Development Alternatives, Ahmedabad. She has completed her master's in economics from Banaras University, Varanasi, and Harvard University, USA. Apart from academic qualification, she has obtained training in classical music. She has written a number of books and published in many research papers, and she has participated in national and international conferences. We have Dr. Ilaben Bhatt. She will deliver Dr. I.G. Patel Memorial Lecture in the presence of Dr. Alaknandaben Patel, the wife of Dr. I.G. Patel. Dr. Ilaben Bhatt is the founder, General Secretary of Self-Employed Women's Association, Ahmedabad, SEWA. She is also a founder chair, SEWA Cooperative Bank. By profession, she is a lawyer, philanthropist, and activist. She is a member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, nominated by the President of India. Besides this, she holds many positions at national and international level. Currently, she is a member of governing body in Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. She received Padma Shri Award in the year 1985. She was awarded Padma Bhushan in the year 1986. We are privileged to have Dr. Ilaben Bhatt among us. I extend a warm welcome to Dr. Ilaben Bhatt and welcome her to share her views and ideas with us. We request Dr. Ilaben Bhatt.
So are you ready for another long session of purely listening to a lecture? Thank you. Respected Chair of the Gujarat Economic Association, Chair of the Trust, and also Dr. Alaknandaben, and all distinguished scholars and friends and professors, researchers, students, our guests from outside Gujarat, I welcome you. When I was invited by Rohit Bhai and Mohan Bhai to give this lecture, I was very hesitant. Not because of the content of my lecture, but mostly, more because of the audience. So I was hesitating, but still I wanted to share my thoughts, my feelings of the thoughts, and so which is mainly centrality of work. So I'm going to speak on the subject on centrality of work. I feel proud and fortunate to start this talk. Dedicated to Dr. I.G. Patel. Most people would remember I.G. as a brilliant economist, an able academician, a towering figure in many national and international organizations, a distinguished contributor to development policies as the head of UNDP, as a governor of the RBI, an intelligent, an intellectual giant, and as a global citizen. However, my first meeting with him was rather down to earth. He wanted to know about the work of Seva and came to meet me as I was about to go to office on my scooter. I asked him to sit down on the pillion and took him to the office via the Ahmedabad old city neighborhoods of Daryapur and Shahpur, where our Seva women worked. It is in the memory of this meeting that I would like to dedicate this I.G. Patel Memorial Lecture on centrality of work, which is in the lives of Indian people, and trace my own journey that brings me to talk in the presence of eminent economists meeting at the annual conference in Anand. Thank you very much, Alaknandaben, for your kind presence today. My college in Surat was asked to collect primary data on slum families for independent India's first census of 1951. I joined the college team and filled out survey forms, although my parents disapproved of me wandering in dirty neighborhoods. The Menafalia in Machipit of Surat was not far from where I lived, but it could just as well have been worlds away. In this slum, the men and boys fished in the river, the women sold the fish. In the morning, they ate millet or jawar rotla with chilies and garlic, and in the evening, they made a meal of boiled vegetables and any unsold fish. Nothing of this data registered in my mind in terms of work or poverty, except that I liked the people who were frank and talkative. At the end of the months of survey, what I remembered most vividly was the fish smell, the tiny backyards where they used dirty water to grow papaya and lilies, and mosquitoes, and that the women invariably wore fresh flowers in their unkempt hair. In 1955, armed with a law degree, I joined the legal department of Textile Labor Association in Ahmedabad. The trade union became my alma mater. My early days in the court were tense, perhaps being the only woman. I was arguing small cases of union workers on matters like leave compensation, shift changes, canteen facilities in the mills. In 1968, the closure of two major textile mills rendered thousands of workers jobless. I was assigned by my senior leader, Shyamprasad Vasavada, to meet those workers' families and find how they managed their lives while unemployed. I saw that it was their women who earned and fed the family. My eyes were open and I began to understand the types of work women did. It was now visible to me that they sold fruits and vegetables in the downtown market or in the streets. Many of these women worked in their homes at piece rate for middlemen, doing what? Stitching, rolling bidis, agabatti, cooking foodstuff. A very large number of women worked as laborers in wholesale commodity markets like textile, clothes, spices, and other merchandise, loading, unloading, head loading at godowns, railway stations. There were women collecting recyclable refuse from mills, shops, city streets. A great many children had stopped going to schools so they could help their mothers make the two ends meet. And there were many more such occupations for earning a living that I saw mainly done by women. Looking at these workers who were invisible to all, voiceless, isolated, working hard for earnings that barely supported them, left me restless, and I felt agitated as to why the TLA did not really see them as workers. Gradually, I began to question the meaning of work, worker, trade union. Now I was coming to a simple realization that the self-employed workers need a union of their own. Is about coming together. Women need not come together merely against anyone. They needed to come together for themselves. By forming a union of self-employed women, by forging a common bond, the poor women self-employed affirmed their economic status and thus generated their visibility and voice through SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association. In the process of unionizing, the first lesson we learned was that struggles by the working poor will have to be carried at all the levels of injustice. One, at the level of the direct exploiter whom you face, that is a policeman or a hard-hearted employer or a vicious contractor. The second level of injustice is at the government agencies and the legal structure. The government department, which are either corrupt or who do not perceive these workers within their purview. They are not workers, so the law does not apply to them, was the standard response that we heard most often. None of the labor laws applied to them. My legal training was of no use in this case. The municipality treated the poor street vendors as criminals. The courts did not take women's work seriously. All this exploitation is sustained because of the injustice at the third level, the highest level. I am convinced that the most difficult struggle to change the mindsets of those involved in policy and lawmaking, education, research, and technology. Through experience, SEWA learned that the struggle has to be carried at all the three levels, and this is the path we have walked for 40 years. We soon learned that mere struggles by protests and court cases do not yield results. They are like hitting your head against the wall because the laws, policies, public perceptions do not understand you. I realized this when the Chinde workers' demand for raising their wages could not succeed much in the court, nor in the negotiations with the trader cum employer. Instead, those who raised their voice were victimized. When these victimized organized their producers' cooperative called Sabina, they could enter the mainstream of the quilt market as equals. They could face those very trader and employers against whom they were fighting in labor court. The important lesson learned was that the strategy of joint action of union and cooperative can lend bargaining power to the self-employed to raise their income and much more. The success story of the very poor Chindi workers in Daryapur spread to neighboring Shahpur area, which is the center of garment workers in Ahmedabad. We did a survey and found that 84% of these women workers, who mostly made baby clothes, earned less than 500 rupees a month. Since the production costs were borne by the workers, the earnings left in their hands were a mere rupees 300 per month. We wanted to hold classes for the teachers under the government scheme of workers' education. But the reply by Labor Department was the same: they are not workers. Now, Our demand with the State Labor Department was clear and bold. We want statutory minimum wage. This struggle for minimum wages had gained strength because the Chindi workers and BD workers joined hands with the garment workers. Thus, the poor self-employed women's organizing spread at the grassroots beyond geographical borders, caste, class, religion, and issues. I remember when vendors were on strike in Manikchowk, the Chindi workers, who happened to be Muslims, took care of the vendors' children, who happened to be Wagari, in their home. The rat pickers, who happened to be Dalits, supplied the lunch packets to the strikers. The women's common identity as workers was now evident. There was high excitement of togetherness that led to the Seva movement spreading laterally. Work is central in poor people's lives, in everybody's life. In Seva, we have approached the question of work in several ways, which has given us an insight into how our society, through its legal, political, social, and economic systems, views and organizes work. First, we have dealt with women's work from the perspective of a labor union. Through this approach, it became clear that Indian labor laws view work as a relationship between an employer and an employee. In this model of industrial relations, the worker is considered an industrial man, a worker with one formal contract, regular working hours, and a living wage. In the Indian context, this leaves out 90% of our workforce who have no fixed employer-employee relationship, no fixed place of work, and who do many kinds of work, often in the same day or season to season. Earnings are so low that they have to work longer and longer hours, often 10 to 12 hours a day, just to survive. The work is often so physically demanding that it results in illness and disability. It is often so insecure that workers have to endure physical discomfort and constant humiliation just to keep the jobs they have. So, we have begun in the labor field to think about how to define a worker, what kind of protection they need, and what kind of social security. Hence, our campaigns for a national policy for street vendors and for the ILO Convention for home workers. Second, we have approached work by addressing the practical need of the women for more income generating work. We have found that with the proper inputs, such as finance and training, work that is marginal to the market can begin to yield higher incomes. Also, in cases where returns are low due to unfair practices, gaining ownership of resources has been shown to raise incomes. Credit, technology, improved skills, and better management all lead to better returns from work. Third, we have approached work through macroeconomic analysis. For example, the government rarely allocates resources to women. They are not seen as part of the budget. Similarly, when resources are directed at the village level, women's needs for employment and basic security are of low priority. These women are seen as objects of poverty reduction programs whose needs are less and less relevant given the emphasis on growth, not social justice. Policymakers are obsessed with growth, somehow seeing the economy as having nothing to do with people. They seem to think that growth comes primarily from the corporate sector or from the public sector. But in fact, the most people work in what I call people sector, not informal sector. That is why we live in Seva, calculated the contribution of the informal sector, that is people sector, to the economy as 63% of GDP, 50% of savings, and 40% of exports. So this is the year 2000. Whichever way we approach the issue of work, we found constraints and obstacles. First, of course, were the vested interests that benefit from the poverty of workers. Backing these are laws and policies which are negative to the women's work, labor laws or municipal laws which do not recognize the women, globalization policies which deprive them of job opportunities, certification policies which do not recognize their skills, investment policies which do not allow them to develop their assets, social policies which do not give them the support they need, such as childcare. The laws and policies are based on attitudes towards work and theories about work that are far from the reality on the ground. Work is seen only as labor or as a job where there is an employment relationship. Only some types of work are viewed as productive and worthy of investment and credit. Most work is seen as unproductive. Many of these theories are based on a particular understanding of the nature of the economy that defines what is work and what is not. Work can be seen in many different ways. Often, what is commonly seen as work is not counted as work by economists and policymakers. Work that is valued most by women is regarded as unproductive. Attitudes towards work can also vary from culture to culture. Today, in almost every country, there is pressure to promote only types of work fit for the global market economy. Others are downgraded by taking these types of work out of the market, calling them unproductive, or by reducing the price of such work. However, our purpose is not to analyze what work is, but to change the concept of work and to think of a direction and vision that will build a society or an economy where there is more equality and human development. We believe that work is a crucial element in all societies. We would like to attempt an approach towards the idea of work based on our understanding of Indian philosophy and in particular its interpretation by Gandhi. Our first and foremost concern is mainly to understand why the work that most people do is not valued by mainstream economic systems and policies. We hear and read about mainstream economics uses the term labor and employment for work. The current World Development Report of World Bank is titled as jobs, not work. It is not an inclusive title. Labor and employment are connected with earning income. Labor is approached from the standpoint of production and creation of wealth, not from the viewpoint of the worker. We learn the worker is transformed into a factor of production through labor. Labor can be manual or intellectual. It can be used to produce goods or services. It belongs or is owned by the worker, but in hiring out his labor, the worker has to hire out himself. In other words, labor cannot be detached like other factors of production. The worker becomes both the owner of labor power as well as performer of labor. We learn economics assumes that in modern society, a person is only able to live if he is connected with the economy through the market. However, labor is not always something that people want to do. It is often something they are forced to do in order to satisfy their basic needs. In economics textbooks, the question is, what is it that motivates people to work? Is answered only by the desire to earn money and as much as it as possible. For most people, however, the desire for money or income is based in the desire to survive, as they cannot get income without work. The necessity of work, as opposed to the desire for wealth creation, the necessity of work means that many people cannot avoid work that is unpleasant, uninspiring, or boring. Laboring has always been identified with onerous activity. I learn, literally, labor implies toil, distress, and trouble. In French, I learn, it means to torture, and in Greek, it means labor means pain and effort. Employment is a broader concept than labor and is used mainly to estimate the गबड़ी पढ़ से गबड़ी नहीं पढ़ हाँ sorry. Employment is a broader concept than labor and is used mainly to estimate the number of people engaged in productive or income earning work. Employment became an important measure when full employment was a main goal of government policies and trade unions. Although governments no longer consider this as a responsibility, the measurement of employment and unemployment continues. For a different interpretation, we go to Indian Hindu philosophical thought and to the Bhagavad Gita. Here the definition of work includes all human interactions with Prakriti or nature. God by his incessant activities preserves the world and prevents it from falling back into non-existence. So, if we approach the question of the relationship between an individual and her work in a holistic way, we see both work and the individual as part of a larger meaning of life. The Bhagavad Gita has a clear exposition on work as a way to self-discovery and the meaning of life, and gives a message of salvation through the principle of action, which is equivalent to work. This is because it is not possible for us to abstain from work. Nature is ever at work, and we are deluded if we fancy that its processes can be held up. Nor is cessation from work desirable, because inertia is not freedom. Clearly, such concepts are at odds with the idea of economic man, the idea of the multiplication of wants and the growth of consumer society contrast sharply with a prescription of the dignity or sanctity of labor. Islamic societies have their own concepts of work based on the Holy Quran and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad through his life and sayings. The word amal has been used in the Quran to mean work, actions, or deeds, and is in 360 verses. All these verses stress the need for work and action by human beings. An important related concept is that of amal salih, interpreted as good work or good deed. Although action or work must be carried out continuously, it cannot be any kind of action, but must be good or beneficial to society. The precepts of the Quran revolve around what is pleasing to Allah. The most important condition for the deed to be good is sincerity. That is to say, to expect only Allah's pleasure as a result of that act and no other benefit. Islam gives dignity and honor to labor and work. Work is so dignified and honorable that the prophets, who are the noblest of the human beings, had engaged themselves in labor and hard work for earning their own livelihoods. Work is understood through cultural meanings. Anthropologists discuss ways in which cultures view themselves. In an individualistic society, a person considers himself independent of relationships, based on impersonal elements as abstract rights, attributes, desires, preferences, and even professional occupations. In holistic societies, an individual considers himself in relation to society as a whole and sees himself as the nexus of a web of relationships. Under the individualistic cultural conceptions of work, the worker enters the market, exchanges her work for money, having to enter the market to meet her basic needs, to sustain herself and her family. Her basic needs can only be met if she buys goods and services from the market. There is no other way she can survive. To meet her needs, she must consume an ever-increasing number of commodities, stimulated by an ever wider choice of commodities. The income needed to buy can only be obtained by becoming a worker or becoming dependent or a worker. A worker is generally someone with a job and an employer-employee relationship. Thank you. A worker is generally someone with a job and an employer-employee relationship working outside the home. Everyone else is considered as someone who does not work. A worker earns an income through self-employment or through a job. Thus, she can sell her labor or become an entrepreneur or an employer who sells goods and services. While in an individualistic, market-dominated economy, a person's identity is based on work and consumption. The worth of her work is the worth of the income she receives. In this way, people equate their worth to the price their work receives. But the market is competitive, with prices determined by competitive forces. So, to receive an income from the market, a worker must be competitive with others. While the holistic view, which is still prevalent in India, sees work as embedded in the larger social and cultural systems. Work is part of, not separate from, life. It is embedded in social and cultural processes in many ways. There is a close interrelation between work and the social system of caste. Work is part of religion. Work binds together the community, and work is seen as contributing to the development of identity and self-worth. With these considerations in mind, it is worth reflecting on our experience with women in Seva in order to describe how Indians think and feel about their work. History in India was always transmitted orally, developed in stories and songs. It is only in recent times that the written word has displaced the spoken one. For example, when the British legal and administrative systems sanctioned written documents as evidence, downgrading the spoken word. However, even today, where communities are closely knit, the spoken word do carry higher value. Among Seva, women, for example, documents documents and written literature are rarely used. The main way of communication is through stories and songs, passed down from generation to generation. There are a vast number of songs that women sing that indicate how they feel about their work and reveal powerful feelings and perceptions. For most Seva women, their work is an integrated part of their lives, their families, their communities, their religion and faith, and their personal identities. The following song shows how a villager links himself to the people in his village and how all the needs are supplied within the village. So I give you an example of the song. Shall I sing? It's in Gujarati. दमड़ी लईने हूँ तो सुथारवाड़े गई थी, दमड़ी लईने हूँ तो सुथारवाड़े गई थी, मियाँ को माफो बीबी कुवेल छोकरे को गाड़ी दे, नहीं तुम्हारी दमड़ी पाछी दे। दमड़ी लईने हूँ तो कुंभारवाड़े गई थी, मियाँ को घड़ो बीबी कुमार छोकरे को कोड़िया दे, नहीं तुम्हारी दमड़ी पाछी दे। दमड़ी लईने हूँ तो लुहारवाड़े गई थी, मियाँ को तलवार बीबी को छरी छोकरे को कातर दे, नहीं तुम्हारी दमड़ी पाछी दे। दमड़ी लईने हूँ तो दर्जीवाड़े गई थी, मियाँ को डगला बीबी को सुथना छोकरे को जबला दे, नहीं तुम्हारी दमड़ी पाछी दे। So, you know, in this song, how so I think I will not explain the song. I think most of you have understood. There is another folk song about growing and processing of cotton that shows how a woman relates to the production within the village and demonstrates how each step in the production process is undertaken by a different skilled person. In the song, which is Vada Pachade Kapas No Chod. So in this song, the singer is able to identify each person by name so that while cloth is being produced, she is also relating to different women in the village. While the song brings out the economic interdependence between castes, it also illustrates the hierarchies with the merchant's wife being the beneficiary of the work of other village women. The song in English, I will say, it says that a cotton plant in my backyard, each pod weighs 1/4 of a say. Who will shell the cotton pod? Laborous woman will shell the cotton pod. Farmer's wife will spin the yarn. Weaver's wife will weave the yarn. Washerman's wife will wash the cloth. Tailor's wife will stitch the cloth. Who will wear the garment? The wife of the merchant will wear the blouse and the skirt. So for most people, also, religion plays an important part in their lives. Women in particular are in contact with the gods through their work. This song is sung daily while grinding grain. Today, grain grinding by hand has been replaced by machine, yet this song is still popular. घंटी मारी आरण कारण, घंटी मारी हैया धारण, ओशिके उद्धव जी बैठा पाटलिए प्रभु जी, गाले गोविंद जी बैठा हाथे हनुमान जी बैठा, थाला माँ शिव जी बैठा पैया पुरुषोत्तम जी। सुखडे सगरामनी मीठा बाजना रे मीठा बाजरा ना मेवारे घंटी मारी आरण कारण. So in the morning they sing, that they still sing this. Anyway, it was once believed that with the advent of Western economic and political systems, the caste system would weaken and that people's social, political and economic identification with their caste would shrink. The opposite that has happened. Castes that vote as a bloc have acquired political influence. Today's economic systems encourage concentration of resources and capital in order to capture markets. This encourages solidarity within castes. In a system where resources are scarce, it is caste solidarity that enables individuals to gain access to economic resources. With the Indian state as a major employer, the government jobs are a source of economic security. The castes with land have not only acquired more land, but have made their way into other trades such as real estate. The fast-growing IT economy is controlled by castes with a tradition of learning, while trade remains firmly in the hands of trading castes. The weaker castes continue to perform types of work that are less paying and insecure. Modern technology has affected religion in India, leading people to become more religious. With the spread of mass communication, religious festivals and rituals which were confined to one part of the country have become popular everywhere. Younger people tend to be more religious than their parents, and in many ways, religion gives people both an identity and a way of life. Many new and opulent temples, mosques, gurudwaras, and other places of worship have been built in recent years in all parts of the country. Religious festivals have become bigger and more celebrated. Religious rituals have been revived, modified to fit modern circumstances. However, the basic tenets and value systems of the religions have become hazier, and the rites and rituals have become the face of most religions. Such forces lead to some disturbing aspects of India's changing economy with its extreme poverty and the growing gap between rich and poor. Being poor in India means meeting one's daily survival needs through labor that is often physically demanding, debilitating, demeaning, and usually underpaid. The Indian economy and Indian society is changing rapidly. Economic growth, the entry of large companies and new technologies is causing the traditional economies to change. There are many new employment opportunities, but there is also growing disparity in security and vulnerability. What is a good society? We believe the first principle of a moral society is to ensure that the poorest and most vulnerable are provided with their basic needs. Taking care of the most vulnerable has a strong moral basis in most societies. Managements and policies must reduce the insecurity of the poor and weak. Although the importance of focusing on poverty and the poor is addressed in mainstream macroeconomic policy, it is not seen as the driving principle of economic life. The poor are seen as marginal to economic life as a whole and are only taken care of through special schemes and safety nets. We propose that the economic structure be such that deprivation cannot exist, and where meeting basic needs is the first priority. This requires a moral society to focus on those who are deprived of the minimum, that is the poorest. But it also requires structures to identify these poorest and to ensure that production satisfies their basic needs. In India, a recent coherent concept of a good society was developed during the era of the freedom struggle and combined the idea of freedom from alien rule with a more complete idea of economic and social freedom. This concept was developed as Swaraj or self-governance, which was seen not merely as a political system managed by and for Indians, but as the basis for a better society. In Harijan, 1946, Gandhiji writes, if Swaraj was not meant to civilize us and to purify and stabilize our civilization, it would be worth nothing. The very essence of civilization is that we give a paramount place to morality in all our affairs, public and private. The Swaraj of my dream is the poor man's Swaraj. The success of the freedom movement was due to the involvement of the masses, and this was possible because Swaraj conveyed not only of political freedom, but more importantly, economic freedom, especially for the poorest. He also writes that working for economic equality means abolishing the eternal conflict between capital and labor. It means the leveling down of the few rich in whose hands is concentrated the bulk of the nation's wealth on the one hand, and a leveling up of the semi-starved millions on the other. A non-violent system of government is an impossibility if the wide gulf between the rich and poor persists. Our first issue concerns justice. A more just society requires that ownership of economic resources be distributed more equitably. Within most countries and across nations, the distribution and ownership of wealth tends to be concentrated in certain areas, and generally, the wealthier areas attract more resources and the poorer areas lose them. Economic decentralization is the way, although not necessarily the only way, of distribution of resources. Poverty or vulnerability criteria are not as simple as for other vulnerable groups like aged, widows, or say disabled. The most successful practices in these processes of identification would occur at local level. Reaching the poorest has been a major administrative exercise when organized centrally on a national level. A more efficient system would be one where food, clothing, and other minimum requirements are distributed locally. Even more efficient would be local production of required needs. We are not proposing that local areas disconnect with mainstream markets, but that a minimum amount of basic needs goods be produced and distributed locally. New technologies and inputs could boost this production and encourage backward and forward linkages with mainstream markets. Gandhiji talked about Swaraj. It was a principle of economic decentralization where there was, where there was local control and local employment. Thinking about the future trend, I understand the people sector requires localness. Here I wish to suggest my 100-mile principle that stems from the ecology of food that we see being ruthlessly violated today. The 100-mile principle, I would urge us to see that our 6 basic primary needs are met from sources within 100 miles around us. These primary needs are food, shelter, clothes, primary education, primary health care, and primary banking. Only 2 pages now. This 100-mile principle views decentralization locality, size, and scale into livelihood. What one needs for livelihood as material, as energy, as knowledge, should stem from areas around us. Seed, soil, water are forms of knowledge that need to be retained locally. Security stems from local innovations, not distant imports. We need to get away from a world that make it impossible for people to eat what they grow and grow what they eat. In the world that make it impossible for people to eat what they grow and grow what they eat. And since they have lost control over their basic production and daily consumption and have become a part of a system whose outcomes are determined by people far away in a manner not in their interest or control. On the other point is connected with holistic work. We have seen that in many societies, especially among women, work is satisfying and creative if it is part of communal life. Decentralized production gives communities greater control over what they produce and how it is to be used. This might mean that part of the production process can be used to generate surplus for exchange or for own use. We have seen that local organization of production links more easily with local cultures and developed within a holistic and sustainable approach to development. Local production and distribution also strengthens the economic role of women. Much of their work is non-monetary and meant for use within the family. Much community work that involves maintaining social relationships is mainly done by women. Economic decentralization would lead to two trends that would be beneficial. It would strengthen local markets and local skills and make markets more accessible to the poor and the actual producers. It would raise the value of non-monetary or reproductive work, including all forms of community and service work, as this would acquire a more holistic meaning and come to be understood as work done for maintenance of society. Of course, let me repeat again that the arguments presented here by no means suggest that local communities should de-link from the larger society. On the contrary, local markets need better linked with larger markets, while the flow of goods, services, and knowledge needs to be strengthened. What is being suggested is a means to redress inequality